is an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. In this episode, tragedy strikes, as we had to expect. I just didn't want to face it. I didn't want this to be real. I hated it. And I don't know what is coming. It felt so unfinished, and I don't understand part of it. We'll talk about it. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Many thanks to Jason for commissioning this episode. This is the very final installment in the 5th season, the first book. And I really was not at all ready for how this ended. It was so... I figured that we were going to have to resolve her time on the island because... obviously, we get her present day, and I put that in quotes because everything is sort of like present tense, even though it's not. We get her now in this, like crystal sort of commune, but the way that it goes down is so much more violent and huge than I expected, and what happens to Alabaster is baffling to me. Frankly baffling. So I read and went back and reread certain parts, and I still don't really get what's going on here. So really, really curious about this, guys. And I'm sure that there's a lot of it that you can't explain to me because it will be a spoiler. But nevertheless, I am going to voice aloud my questions. So we start off with chapter 22. Cyanide fractured. So this is this is the sort of thing that you sort of read it as a kid. And I don't mean this, obviously. This is not meant for children. But I'm talking about the method of writing a really beautiful, satisfying moment of contentment before disaster strikes. And when you're young, you read this and it feels like a story setup. It feels like a cliche. And as you get older, you really start to realize how often things happen in this way. And it's alarming. Like, the number of times that I have consciously thought, wow, things could not really get better than this moment right now. And hours later, not even days later, hours later, got hit with some of the worst news of my life, or things suddenly began to disintegrate. I can't count how many times that's happened. It's enough to make you not want to be happy because you think that you bring it on yourself somehow. That by expressing the fact that things are good and that you feel content, you are inviting the universe to come in and fuck you up. And it's really hard to get past that. It's a knock on wood sort of happiness. And I wish that I didn't believe that and I didn't feel that way, but it happens so frequently, So we start off this chapter and Cyanide is, she's talking about how everybody on the island is celebrating the return of the ship, that Inan really got a lot of incredibly valuable stuff this time around, and that it's going to be enough to feed them and get a cache of food set up for them so that they will be in pretty good shape for the foreseeable future. Cyanide in this moment is really struggling, understandably, with the fact that she killed 2 ships full of people. And it's like, really, it's not fair and it's not right. And it sucks that everything comes down to her having no choice if she wants to keep herself and Alabaster safe. And by extension, keep everyone else on the island safe. Because the whole reason that this island has proven to be such a hospitable place for them to hide out is because they are largely left alone. The island is almost unknown to anyone, and it's treated as something that is like a temporary, like all of the other islands have been, that it is not something that you can settle on because islands are super dangerous. The fact that this particular island has lasted for thousands of years is an anomaly. So if anybody's attention were to be drawn to it and they realized that this civilization that's living here is the same one that's been here and that they have been able to like get by and outlive and outlast, that's something that we just don't want to draw attention to. Who knows exactly how the mainlanders would handle this information? So in that respect, I do think she was protecting mostly herself and Alabaster, and that's fine. Honestly, I don't begrudge her that either. But in the grand scheme, I think it was about more than just the two of them. And you guys, the struggle that she's having with, I think it's a combination of her feeling guilt over killing people, and also feeling guilt in some ways over not feeling more guilt, if that makes sense. And this is something that I personally have struggled with. I can be really good at compartmentalizing things in my life and things that I have done. And I can recognize consciously, intellectually, that something that I did was morally not okay. And yet I can't seem to get myself to care and really feel in my gut like I did something wrong. And that sort of thing happens often enough that I've like questioned myself and my morality more than one time and just been like, what does that mean about me? Am I just a bad person? And it's an interesting question because it's sort of like, I think it depends on what causes you to actually care versus what doesn't. And there are a lot of gray areas in life. And I'd be very interested to hear the different assessments of things that I felt this way about from other points of view and how other people would feel about it or how they would judge it. Not because I'm going to internalize their judgment, but simply because I would like a different point of view. And I think we've all met people who have done pretty despicable things that we think are objectively terrible, and they have not seemed to understand the gravity of what they've done at all. So, then you look at yourself and wonder, am I that person to somebody else? And it's just sort of alarming. And Cyanide is in a position of real power at this point. She's been a fourth ringer. Now she's definitely got two more at least. Alabaster makes them, even though she sort of rejects that at first because she feels like this is a symbol of the fulcrum and this is a symbol of their oppressor, and she doesn't want to live in that world anymore or represent anything from that headspace. But it's also the kind of thing that, like, there is an indisputable association in her mind between having that symbol of accomplishment and being successful and in control. And I find that really interesting. The fact that as much as she rejects them when he first gives them to her, she winds up accepting them. And there's not really an explanation given as to like exactly what changes her mind. We get into her head for a moment before she decides to put them on. After all, I'm going to read this to you guys. So, first of all, they're talking about whether or not she wants to have another child, to which she's like, I most definitely don't. I didn't even want this child. And there's a really, I think, compelling moment. Those of you who are not aware, I think most people are, but there probably are some who are not. The stigma surrounding the hair of Black people is really real. And there have been a lot of things coming up in the news recently of children at school being told that they should not wear their hair certain ways. And even a wrestler at a match was taken aside by a referee and had his braids cut off, which was not according to regulation, and people are flipping out about it, but not flipping out enough. This person, the referee, I think, got like put on probation, didn't get fired, and now the referee is trying to sue the school for like emotional distress. We won't get into that whole thing, but Jesus Christ. So, and the idea of having an afro, which is a very, like, that's how some hair grows out of people's heads. Straight out. And that's just how it is. But there are so many lines of work in which having that kind of hairstyle is considered, quote, unprofessional. And to make it professional, you must tame it down in some way that basically mimics white hair. You have to relax it. You have to flat iron it. You have to do something. Cut it off and wear a wig. You need to represent our limited understanding of what professional looks like. And it always equals looking more like a white person. And it's really disgusting, the number of states that are like not willing to even pass laws saying that people are allowed to wear dreadlocks and not be discriminated against when they're being hired because they have locks. There are so many places that they've tried to pass laws, anti-discrimination laws, to defend that some people's hair grows a certain way that is different than white people's. And they are not being passed. These bills aren't coming through. And even native hair, which one would argue is a lot more similar to white hair in that it is like, it falls and it's softer in texture, that is still looked down on in a lot of schools. And boys who wear long hair, according to the traditions of their tribe, are told that they have to cut their hair off. It's a part of forced assimilation, and it's a relic of a time in our history where that sort of thing was enforced more officially by the government. And now it's like still done low-key enforced by the government, but in a much more masked and guarded way, which makes it more insidious. So I have noticed throughout this book mentions of hair, and the fact that people's hair, like texture, has been described as really coarse or stiff. And even in Children of Blood and Bone, her hair is like straight and silky at first. And as she begins to come back into her power, it starts to tighten up and become curlier and curlier until it's outright kinky. And it's a very interesting thing because so many of us have been conditioned to want silky straight hair that we view her hair kinking up as a negative. But the characters in the story are telling her, your hair looks amazing now. You've just looked so much better with it like this. And just points out how internalized our idea of what is beautiful is wrapped around race. So we have this moment with her talking with Alabaster. Alabaster reaches up to stroke her hair away from her face. He does that a lot now that she wears it loose. She's always been a little ashamed of her hair. It's curly, but with no stiffness to it at all, whether the straight stiffness of Sansad hair or the kinky stiffness of coaster hair. She's such a mid-ladder mutt that she doesn't even know which of her ancestors to blame for the hair. At least it doesn't get in her way. I really, really love that line. Just she doesn't know which to blame for her hair. As somebody with really curly hair, I used to feel that way about my father. I would blame him for my curly hair because I grew up in the 90s in a white neighborhood and nothing says 90s more than stick straight, middle parted hair and no hips. And I was the opposite of both of those things. And so, of course, I must be hideous. And I just wish I could go back in time and shake and slap myself, because I really believed it. I believed it in my bones. People would tell me, I love your hair. I wish I had your hair. And I straight up didn't believe it. I thought they were saying that to be nice because they pitied me. That's just what I thought. And this moment of her, like, sort of envying this hair texture that is mostly looked down on in our society now, is a really beautiful little point that she's making about how differently things could be if colonizers hadn't enforced their appearance on the rest of the entire world. What would it be like if that kind of hair texture was valued and sought after, instead of being a mark of, God knows what we even want to call it, but something to be ashamed of and to hide? And it's sort of heartbreaking to think about that it doesn't have to be the way that it is. It doesn't have to. But white people have done it. We've made it this way and continue to do so by enforcing ideas of what professionals look like, about what is acceptable at work, about what is acceptable for, presentation of yourself in a certain light. And it's so insidious and so gross. So I just wanted to mention that because it really struck me. And I had meant to mention it earlier and kept getting sidelined by the other insane parts of this story. But since this is the last episode on this book, I felt like I had to take my chance while I remembered. So she is talking with him about, we are what we are. We are Misalem, not Shemshana. You've heard that story? And she says, yes. And he says, they like to tell that one to kids. My guardians gave me that nonsense too. The monstrous Misalem who decided to declare war against a whole nation and off the Sanzad Empire for no particular reason. And she says he had a reason? And he's like, fucking duh. Think about it at all. And she's a little irritated here, but she's also been really mopey and upset and turned inward. So what he's doing is sort of like forcing her out of this shell that she has created around herself by getting her irritated and argumentative, which is actually working pretty well. And he says, and this story is pretty crazy, the simplest and most powerful reason of all, revenge. That emperor was Anaphumeth, and the whole thing happened just after the end of the season of teeth. That's the season they don't talk about much in any creche. There was mass starvation in the Northern Hemisphere comms. They got hit harder since the Sheikh had started the whole thing near the North Pole. The season took a year longer to take hold in the Equatorials and the South. And he explains that he knows all of this despite not really being taught, because he was so strong, so young with his power, that he was given a lot of special privileges, and one of them was being allowed to just go around the library and read whatever he wanted. So there are some histories in there that maybe they don't want him to know, but they didn't really keep an eye on him. And he says, if you put the facts together and think beyond what we're taught, Sanza was a new empire then, still growing and at the height of its power, but it was mostly in the northern half of the Equatorials at the time. Yemenis wasn't actually the capital then, and some of the bigger Sanzad comms weren't as good at preparing for seasons as they are now. They lost their food store caches somehow. To survive, all the Sanzad comms decided to work together, attacking the comms of any lesser races. That's when they started calling us lesser races, actually. Cyan says, so they took the other comms store caches. And he's like, no, they didn't have any store caches left. The Sanzad took people. And she starts to be like, people for what? And then she realizes, because initially you think slaves, Nope, they were definitely eating them. They were eating people, and it becomes like enough of a thing that once that necessity is past, they still keep eating people. That season is when the Sanzids developed a taste for certain rarefied delicacies, and even after the season ended and green things grew and the livestock turned herbivorous or stopped hibernating, they kept at it. They would send out parties to raid smaller settlements and newcoms held by races without Sanzid allies. All the accounts differ on details, but they agree on one thing. Misalim was the only survivor when his family was taken in a raid. Supposedly his children were slaughtered for Anafumeth's own table, though I suspect that's a bit of a dramatic embellishment. Regardless, they died, and it was Anafumeth's fault, and he wanted Anafumeth dead for it like any man would. And then this part I had to highlight because it's just like a fucking punch in the face. But a Raga is not any man. Ragas have no right to get angry, to want justice, to protect what they love. For his presumption, Shemshana had killed him and became a hero for doing it. Cyanide considers this in silence. Then Alabaster shifts a little, and she feels his hand press the bundle, the one with the rings in it, into her unresisting palm. Listen, guys, you all, I assume, and I may be wrong, but I'm going to assume, if you're listening to this podcast, you have done some of the work of researching the history of this country, because I talk and Rashawn talks enough about it in most of our recordings that it has started to be brought to people's attention. Our history that we are taught is garbage. It's bullshit. We are taught a one-dimensional, black and white, heroic version of a history that is so drenched in blood and betrayal and inhuman horror, just outright horror, that it's frankly shameful that we even teach history at all sometimes. I feel like it would be better for kids to know nothing than to know the outright lies that we tell them as they get older. And finding out about histories like this experience that Alabaster has, realizing that somebody who has been painted as a villain actually had an incredibly valid reason for coming after a person, is very familiar to a lot of us, I think. When you start to look into the history behind certain figures that have taken on an almost mythical quality because of how hugely they loom over the course of history, we want to give those people similarly mythical goodness and morality. And unfortunately, they were not mythical, they were people. And they were people who were products of their time and products of really limited understanding and products of oftentimes a huge ambition that would work to cloud their judgment on things because it's easier to believe that people you are fighting deserve what they get. People you are enslaving deserve to be enslaved. So this thing where he's explaining to her how something that she thought she knew about isn't what she thought at all is a small moment, but I think hugely important. And I don't think it's an accident that it's one of the last conversations they ever have, because it's going to come up again. I think that this realization that things she thought she knew are fed to her from a skewed perspective from a people with an agenda is definitely going to come up again. So then he says, Origene's built the fulcrum. She's almost never heard him say Origene. We did it under threat of genocide, and we used it to buckle a collar around our own necks. But we did it. We are the reason old Sanze grew so powerful and lasted so long, and why it still half rules the world, even if no one will admit it. We're the ones who figured out just how amazing our kind can be if we learn how to refine the gift we're born with. It's a curse, not a gift. Cyanide closes her eyes, but she doesn't push away the bundle. It's a gift if it makes us better. It's a curse if we let it destroy us. You decide that, not the instructors or the guardians or anyone else. A moment later, she feels his lips on her brow, dry and approving. Then he settles back down on the floor beside the bed and says nothing more. I thought I saw a guardian, she says after a while, very softly. At Alia. Alabaster doesn't reply for a moment. She's decided that he won't when he says, I will tear the whole world apart if they ever hurt us again. But we would still be hurt, she thinks. It's reassuring, though, somehow. The kind of lie she needs to hear. Cyanide keeps her eyes closed and doesn't move for a long while. She's not sleeping, she's thinking. Alabaster stays while she does, and for that she is unutterably glad. So that's the last, convo like this that we see between the two of them before everything goes to hell. So I had said something last episode when the big reveal is made that Ashlynn is actually Cyanide also. I had said that the girl who had broken into the fulcrum, who is now an adult and following her around pretending to be somebody else, I had thought this girl was the one that she saw on the banks, because she says to Cyanide, I saw you, I was there watching you and waiting for you to return to see if you were still okay. And I saw what you did at Alia when you fixed it. So I assumed that whoever Cyanide saw on the banks was that woman. And I had initially assumed that it was a guardian. So I got lulled back into a false sense of calm because of this woman assuaging my fears. Because initially, when she fixed Alia, I 100% thought it was a mistake and was like, look, I understand why you did this, but lady, they left it that way on purpose. They left it because they knew whoever did this had a certain power that they would try and use to fix it if they survived it. 3 years is a long, long time, but still. So this, it turns out, was exactly what I thought. A guardian saw her, and they go back and get a crew that fills about 3 ships, I think. And it's such a shame the way this is written. When the world ends 3 weeks later, it happens on the most beautiful day Cyanide has ever seen. The sky is clear for miles, save for the occasional drift of cloud. The sea is calm, and even the omnipresent wind is warm and humid for once instead of cool and scouring. So everybody in the community decides that they are going to enjoy the hell out of this unusually beautiful day, and they all get picnics and blankets and all of their work that they need to do and bring it up these cliff sides and set up blankets and it's a really sweet moment because you get a bit more of a look at the way that she and Alabaster interact with this group of people as well. She's come to realize over the past 3 years that most Maevites regard her and Alabaster as something like wild animals that have decided to scavenge off human habitations. Impossible to civilize, kind of cute, and at least an amusing nuisance. So when they see that she obviously needs help with something and won't admit it, they help her anyway. And they constantly pet Alabaster and hug him and grab his hands and swing him into dancing, which Cyan is at least grateful no one tries with her. Then again, everyone can see that Alabaster likes being touched, no matter how much he pretends standoffishness. It probably isn't something he got a lot of in the Fulcrum, where everyone was afraid of his power. Perhaps likewise, they think Cyan enjoys being reminded that she is part of a group now, contributing and contributed to, and that she no longer needs to guard herself against everyone and everything. They're right. That doesn't mean she is going to tell them so. So there is a significance to this, I think, in that, and this is, again, I feel like dealing specifically with expectations in the Black community, but also dealing with, in some ways, like patriarchy. There is, the stereotype of the strong Black woman who doesn't need any help with anything, who can manage her own life completely, is absolutely independent. And there are a lot of Black women who have struggled with feeling like they are not allowed to ask for help because people interpret it as being grasping, needy, dependent, a gold digger in the worst cases. And thus they do not want to accept help or depend on anyone that they feel they can't depend on forever, because people are often unreliable and you don't want to become dependent on the help of somebody that is going to disappear on you. So I feel like that is a little bit of what the author is hinting at here with Cyanide. And with Alabaster, this is true of Black men for sure, but men in general as well. Men are not encouraged to be physical unless it is sexual. And the fact that Alabaster is gay on top of this is a really interesting, I don't feel like this is her saying he's gay and therefore likes to be touched and is more feminine because of that. I feel like that is simply him embodying all of the things that stereotypically are considered weaker. And yet he has this insane power that is so dangerous and intimidating. And that may be the reason why he has been denied some of these basic human interactions with people. And so I really enjoy that she has Alabaster craving this sort of contact with people, because I just think it's something that a lot of folks don't really stop and think about. And there have been numerous posts on Facebook recently. There was a man who posted a photo of himself laying in bed. His two little girls are cuddled up on his right side, and his son is barely laying on his arm on the left. And he wrote this long post about how his son had to be explained to his son that a father is not supposed to cuddle his son the way that he does his daughters, but that's how I teach him that he's a man, and I am still proud of him and I still love him, but I'm simply not going to be physically affectionate with him the way I would be with his daughters because it makes him weak. And that is incredibly sad. It's one of those when you read this post, I went into reading it knowing what it was going to say in some ways and expecting it to be a lot more hateful than it was. The post is written by a man who clearly cares about his son and who really thinks he's doing the good and right and smart thing for his kid. And that is the thing that I find so upsetting about it. He believes what he's doing is what's best. He really does. He thinks he's thought this through. He believes that he has considered every possible angle of this and writes this with an air of authority. And you can see this little boy in this photo desperate to be treated the way his sisters are with this display of love, and he won't get it. And how heartbreaking is that? And Alabaster, I can't not think of him as that little boy, kept at arm's length by everybody, very literally. And finally he is somewhere where people aren't afraid of him the same way. He has power, but because he's not in a constant state of everyone being afraid, he is able to have a kind of control over it because his anxiety isn't through the roof like it was. There isn't a constant threat of being harmed or being used to harm. And this is just, there's a lot of gut punches in these last couple of chapters. So I am going to summarize what happens here. Alabaster senses that there is a weird, like, sort of blankness in the plates underneath the island that they can normally feel moving all the time. And as soon as there's that blankness, I was like, fuck, it's Guardians. Oh, shit. And sure enough, it is a really bad scene. Yeah. Cyanide stares after him. The people who preceded Baster up the ridge are shouting and signaling everyone else. Something is wrong. There are 4 ships, tiny but visible, and coming closer. So, Alabaster yanks up a piece of like stone to block off the way in for one ship. And it seems to sort of crash into it and tip. It winds up coming back to itself, and it isn't actually stopped, unfortunately. But it slows them down. And Cyanide takes out another one by shearing off a piece of cliff and having it like fall directly onto the ship. There is and I'm not even like exactly sure what happens to the final 2 ships. I think that Alabaster takes out another one. He stops the one and drops stones onto a second one. And that one really fucks it up. Like, he's not able to use his orogeny to directly attack a ship the way that Cyanide had when she was like on the water with Inan that other time, because she used rock and brought it straight up through the middle of the ship and like sliced it in half. But because the Guardians are essentially immune to her orogeny, her trying to do that, she can only like get it up under the ship and then it stops and it won't go the rest of the way up. So they have to find a like roundabout way to attack. And in the end, she gets trapped, and she had made a promise to Alabaster that she will do anything that she can to keep them from being taken, to keep her son from being taken as a slave. Because this kid is obviously incredibly powerful and not trained at all. So if he is that powerful, but not something that, like, not a child that can be broken, and chances are he is that kind of child that can be broken, they will put him in a node station and do to him what she saw done to that other poor kid that was dead. And it is just unthinkable, you know? So she winds up getting trapped in this area of one of the ships trying to get away. And Inan comes in and is going to try and stab one of the Guardians that's coming towards her. And this is one of the most hideous things. The Guardian grabs Inan and uses Inan's orogeny against him to essentially shake him apart into a pile of matter that I imagine as being something like the muck that is left behind when like a vampire on True Blood is killed. It is a hideous perversion of what he is, and it's using something that makes him unusual and strong and beautiful for evil. And it's just so hard to read. And she's like realizing as she watches it happen that Alabaster told her that this was something that could be done. And he told her about how the Guardian smiled while he did it. And yet she still could not grasp how hideous it was to watch it happen. So Inan is dead. Alabaster, before this being cornered, there is something really, really strange going on. I am going to read this to you. Because okay. That's when she notices his arms at the wrists, his knees, and the rest of his legs between thighs and ankles. They're gone. They haven't been cut off or blown off. Each limb ends smoothly, perfectly, right where the ground begins. And he's moving them about as if it's water and not solid stone that he's trapped in. Struggling, she realizes belatedly. He's not on his hands and knees because he can't stand. He's being dragged into the ground against his will. The Stone Eater. Oh, rusting earth. Cyanide grabs his shoulders and tries to haul him back, but it's like trying to haul a rock. He's heavier somehow. His flesh doesn't quite feel like flesh. The Stone Eater has made his body pass through solid stone by making him more stone-like somehow, and Cyanide can't get him out. He sinks deeper into the stone with each breath. He's up to his shoulders and hips now, and she can't see his feet at all. Let him go, Earth take you! The irony of the curse will only occur to her later. What does occur to her in the moment is to stab her awareness into the stone. She tries to feel for the Stone Eater. There's something else, but not like anything she's felt before. A heaviness, a weight, too deep and solid and huge to be possible. Not in such a small space, not so compact. It feels like there's a mountain there, dragging Alabaster down with all its weight. He's fighting it, that's the only reason he's still here at all, but he's weak. He's losing the fight, and she hasn't the first clue how to help him. The Stone Eater is just too much, too big, too powerful, and she cannot help flinching back into herself with a sense that she's just had a near miss. So, he winds up getting sucked down. The Stone Eater's hand rises from the stone, white and solid and rust-tipped. Surprised, Cyanide screams and flinches, thinking the creature is attacking her, but no. This hand wraps around the back of Alabaster's head with remarkable gentleness. No one expects mountains to be gentle, but they are inexorable, and when the hand pulls, Alabaster goes. His shoulders slip out of Cyan's hands, his chin, then his mouth, then his nose, then his terrified eyes. He is gone. What? Good Lord. I don't even... So, then we have the being cornered. Now Inan is on the floor in a pile. The guardian who has killed him stands there, splattered in blood and grinning through it. So at this point, Guardian Warrant, Shafa, her original guardian, comes at her. And she holds her hand over her child's mouth because he's crying, and she's trying to calm him, but also trying to give him an escape from slavery. And it's really, this is something that is true. It has happened. Women have definitely killed their children rather than letting them go into slavery. Women have this is a child that she didn't even originally want as well. She was forced to bear this child, which is another thing that women were forced to do. And what she has gone through is just beyond belief, and yet completely believable. It's just one of those, and Shafa says to her, a Stone Eater. We should have killed him then before they got to him as a kindness. You cannot imagine what they will do to him, Cyanide. And I couldn't imagine. Spoiler alert. It turns out that they start to eat him. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I just don't even... Shafa's smile fades. Cyanide, I told you, never say no to me. And Cyanide says, no, you fucker. And that's the first time that we've really heard that sort of curse in this. Like, it's always some, like, rusting earth or skies or, something that's, like, related to the seasons. But at this point, Cyanide, that's not my rusting name. I'll say no to you all I want, you bastard. Everyone she loves is dead. Everyone except Karoo. And if they take him, sometimes even we crack. Better that a child never have lived at all than live as a slave. Better that he die. Better that she die. Alabaster will hate her for this, for leaving him alone, but Alabaster is not here, and survival is not the same thing as living. So she reaches up, out. The amethyst is there above, waiting with the patience of the dead, as if it somehow knew this moment would come. She reaches for it now, and prays that Alabaster was right about the thing being too much for her to handle. And as her awareness dissolves amid jewel-toned light and faceted ripples, as Shafa gasps in realization and lunges for her, as Karu's eyes flutter shut over her pressing, smothering hand, she opens herself to all the power of the ancient unknown and tears the world apart. So, this is the moment when the island dies, but at least a few of those inhabitants should survive to go elsewhere. Perhaps that will make you feel better. It doesn't. I'd really rather everybody died, to be honest, and not have to deal with living with this grief and horror. But we don't really get what we want, do we? The purple obelisk that hovers above it pulses once with a great throb of power that would be familiar to anyone who'd been in the lake calm called Alia on the day of its death. As this pulse fades, the ocean below heaves as its rocky floor convulses. Spikes, wet and knife-like, burst up from the waves and utterly shatter the ships that float near the island's shores. A number of the people aboard each, some pirates, some their enemies, are speared through, so great is the thicket of death around them. This convulsion spreads away from the island in a long, wending ripple, forming a chain of jagged, terrible spears from Mayov's harbor all the way to what is left of Alia. A land bridge. Not the sort anyone would much want to cross, but nevertheless. When all the death is done, and the obelisk is calm, only a handful of people are still alive in the ocean below. One of them, a woman, floats unconscious amidst the debris of her shattered ship. Not far from her, a smaller figure, a child, floats too, but face down. Her fellow survivors will find her and take her to the mainland. There she will wander, lost and losing herself, for 2 long years. But not alone, for that is when I found her, you see. The moment of the obelisk's pulse was the moment in which her presence sang across the world. A promise, a demand, an invitation too enticing to resist. Many of us converged on her then, but I am the one who found her first. I fought off the others and trailed her, watched her, guarded her. I was glad when she found the little town called Tirimo and comfort, if not happiness, for a time. I introduced myself to her eventually, finally, 10 years later, as she left Tirimo. It's not the way we usually do these things, of course. It's not the relationship with her kind that we normally seek. But she was special. You are special. I told her I was called Hoa. It's as good a name as any. This is how it began. Listen. Learn. This is how the world changed. So then we go into the final chapter. And it turns out that this spot that you're being brought to, after being told that Alabaster is here and wants to talk to you, is built out of some quartz or something that is other than the crystal that the rest of this commune is built with. And it's sort of weird that anybody would feel the need to do this, but there it is. And when she goes inside, okay, the Stone Eater is here. She looks back at you impassively, hardly distinguishable from the white wall, save for the rust of her fingertips and the stark black of her hair and eyes. She hasn't changed since the last time you saw her 12 years ago, at the end of Mayov. But then for her kind, 12 years is nothing. So Cyanide starts to go closer, and she stops Cyanide, says no closer. And then Cyanide realizes, oh wait, she's not stopping me. She's not talking to me. She's talking to Hoa. And Antimony, it seems, is not a fan. They are looking at each other like they really hate each other, but that they know each other as well. I am not interested in him, Hoa says. Antimony's eyes shift over to you for a moment. Then her gaze returns to Hoa. I am interested in her only on his behalf. Hoa says nothing. Perhaps he's considering this. Perhaps it's an offer of truce. You shake your head and walk past them both. So, Alabaster is partially turned to stone. Still, I was hopeful that whatever had happened to him was something that could be easily undone. For all I know, this is years later, 12 years. It was easily undone, but now there's some other payment to be made. Maybe he's done it again. Maybe, I don't know. But it feels like there's a possibility that he was able to switch back to himself, and then after he did what he did, maybe that caused him to transform. He says, I've been busy. Now Alabaster lifts his right arm. It ends abruptly in the middle of the forearm. He's not wearing anything on his upper body, so you can clearly see what's happened. There's not much left of him. He's missing a lot of pieces, and he stinks of blood and pus and urine and cooked meat. The arm injury, though, is not one he earned from Eumenese's fires, or at least not directly. The stump of his arm is capped with something hard and brown that is definitely not skin. Too hard, too uniformly chalk-like in its visible composition. Stone. His arm has become stone. Most of it's gone, though, and the stump... Tooth marks. Those are tooth marks. You glance up at Antimony again and think of a diamond smile. Yo, that's messed up. She's eating him. The fuck? Oh, man. I can't even understand this, though. Why did she take, there's so much I don't understand here. Yeah. This... Guys, I got nothing. So first of all, I need to acknowledge the diamond teeth being pretty genius, because that's the only thing that can cut through stone, other than itself, it's the hardest one that's out there. So naturally, that's what their teeth would be made of. It just makes sense. Now you know what kind of stone they eat. Now Hoa has been eating something else, but when Hoa points to the stone, he says, I think he says me, myself, something like this over and over again to her, as if he's trying to explain to her. And I can't help but think now that that he doesn't know that she's unaware that they will eat people made of stone, but people nonetheless. And maybe he's trying to impress upon her that he's not going to hurt her, but I'm not positive here. I understand why you killed Corundum, Alabaster says very softly. And then, while you sway in your crouch, literally reeling from the blow of that sentence, he finishes you. But I'll never forgive you for doing it. Damn. Damn him. Damn yourself. I understand if you want to kill me, but I have to kill my husband first. Alabaster lets out a wheezing sigh. Your other two kids. You nod. Doesn't matter that Nasun's alive in this instance. Jija took her from you. That is insult enough. I'm not going to kill you. I wouldn't even if I could. Can you do it yet? You drew on the garnet at Alia, but that one was half dead. You must have used the amethyst at Mayav, but that was an extremity. Can you do it at will now? And at this point, she's starting to understand what he's saying and notices that there's this huge sword, basically, that has this blade that looks like glass. But it's just all of it is oversized, that there's no way that you would even be able to use this thing as a sword. It's pink verging on red, and you stare at it, into it. You feel it trying to draw your mind in, down, falling up through an endless shaft of flickering, faceted pink light. You gasp and twitch back into yourself defensively, then stare at Alabaster. He smiles again, painfully. "The spinel," he says, confirming your shock. "That one's mine. Have you made any of them yours yet? Did the obelisks come when you call?" You don't understand. You don't want to understand, but you do. You don't want to believe, but really, you have all along. "You tore that rift up north," you breathe. "You split the continent. You started this season. With the obelisks, you did all of that." "Yes, with the obelisks and with the aid of the node maintainers. They're all at peace now. I need your help." "To fix it?" "Oh, no, Cyan. I don't want you to fix it. It was collateral damage, but Yemeni's got what it deserved. No, what I want you to do, my Demaya, my Cyanide, my Assun, is make it worse." You stare at him, speechless. Then he leans forward. That this is painful for him is obvious. You hear the creak and stretch of his flesh, and a faint crack at some piece of stone somewhere on him, fissures. But when he is close enough, he grins again, and suddenly it hits you. Evil eating Earth. He's not crazy at all, and he never has been. "Tell me," he says, "have you ever heard of something called a moon?" And that, my friends, is the end of the book. There is an appendix that tells you all about each of the seasons so far and how they were caused, and it's very interesting, but I won't really talk about that because it's not relevant, strictly speaking, right now. But a damn, that is some shit. He is trying to break a piece off of their planet to make a moon. That's what I think is going on here. That's what happened to Earth. You know, like it's so wild actually when you think about it. Our moon, when it first broke off from the Earth and began to slowly orbit around us, was so close that it would scrape the tops off the mountains at times when it passed over, because it was that close and slowly began to edge its way out. And I find that to be such an insane thought. Like, imagine something being that close. Oh, Lord, that would be scary. And yeah, this is what he wants to do, I think. I think he believes that could stabilize the Earth. I can't help but wonder if, like, they did something like that. Would it maintain its own atmosphere? I don't know how this place works. Does he think they could, like, jump off onto it? How do the Stone Eaters work? They can do that? How did she do that? And why would they want to do, like, why is it eating him? Is he letting it? I'm really, guys, I don't know. I don't know what's going on here. Yeah, I don't know. There is so much. Guys, this book is just bananas. It's really, really good, but holy shit. I feel like I only understand like 60-70% of it, and then there's like whole sections of it that I'm just like, this is really interesting, but I don't understand the implications of it. And I'm pretty sure that's by design. I don't think that, you know. But yeah, this was really interesting. So thank you very much to Ashlynn, who got me started on this series. And thank you to Jason, who finished me off on this book so that I was able to wrap it, because enough time passed between some of these chapters that I wondered sometimes if I was going to be able to finish it or not. And I haven't really come up with a, like, what's the word I want? Sort of a time limit for how long something can go without anyone commissioning it, that I am then allowed to continue reading it on my own. A statute of limitations, I guess. And I would imagine it would be like a year, you know, because sometimes people pick things up way later. But I'm not really sure if it should be a year, if that's like reasonable. Because after I have covered, if I've covered half a book and then somebody commissions something a year later, I essentially have to go back and reread the whole first half to remember what the hell even happened. So if, if this series isn't finished within a certain amount of time, I want to be able to finish reading it myself, but I don't know what that looks like. So I'm going to have to ponder that. But yeah, so thank you very, very much to Ashlynn and to Jason. I'm just seeing, I'm sorry guys, I had my Kindle app open and I'm just seeing that there were some comments here. Krista says, always wanted curly hair and never knew why darker skinned women felt it was bad. I was super lucky to miss out on that awfulness, right? And Tony says, so many questions. Mwahaha. Ashlynn, you rock. And Jason. Indeed, Tony. Seconded. So I will wrap this up. Thank you guys for coming and hanging out with me. Thank you all so much for the commission. Really appreciate it. And y'all have good taste, and I'm so glad. And hopefully I will be seeing you again with a new episode. Till then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.